Have you ever stared at a satellite image, searching for patterns and pictures in roads running through distant landscapes? Or how has the slightest change in perspective helped you better understand your local neighborhood? With a laundry list of grand challenges, we are all called upon each and every day to think of out-of-the-box ways to make our world a more sustainable place. This show is about inspiring individuals and their journey along the cutting edges of science, engineering, technology, and design. I'm your host, Peter Marcus Bach, and this is the Grand Challenges podcast. My guest today is Fritz Kleinschroth, a senior scientist in the ecosystem management group at ETH Zurich. Fritz has a diverse research portfolio centered around understanding the effects of human interventions on ecosystem function. His passions have brought him to many places, from the Congo Basin, Ethiopia, and Zambia in the global south, to his very own backyard. On today's show, we delve into the impacts of human activities and adaptability of nature, both on land and water, and discuss the need for reconciliation ecology through the eyes of Fritz's many adventures. For more information, refer to the show notes over at petermbach.com/podcast. Thank you for joining, and please enjoy the show. Fritz, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Peter. It's a pleasure and privilege that you invited me.
You've been doing lots of very interesting kinds of research, and I'm looking forward to delving a bit deeper into that. So thank you for making the time.
Great.
And we're sitting in a hot office. Actually, it's not that hot here in the middle of Zurich on a hot summer day. It's been, this year's been quite warm. But yeah, let's see. It's also a bit of, mental training to withstand the heat and adapt, which I think will also be a bit of a thematic in today's show as well.
Well, let's try to withstand together. But I am looking forward to jumping into the river later.
Yeah, no, that sounds like a great idea. Yeah, I guess from what you just said, outdoors, it's one of your passions. You really love being in the outdoors. And, before I could even go into any of the research, and while I was researching some of the works that you have been producing, and you've researched quite broadly across different topics, there was one thing that kind of relates to what we're talking about now that actually popped up and took me by surprise. And that was you had a research paper. I wouldn't call it a paper, it was quite short. But in your Google Scholar page, I pulled out a paper and it had a very funny title. Beavers are crowd pleasers. And when I opened it up, it was really 3 photos, I think, and a short summary about the introduction of what we call the 19th century Eurasian beaver that was introduced in Switzerland in the 1950s, and how apparently they've been keeping people quite amused, especially during the pandemic. Could you tell me a bit more about how that came about?
Well, this is one of the ways how, in this case, I link my neighborhood and my observations in the neighborhood with science. So, this is really maybe 5 minutes walk from my house. And I knew about this beaver for a long time because he actually ventures into our neighborhood and amuses people. But of course, it's also a bit of a challenge because this beaver family preys on our fruit trees in the neighborhood. So it's not without conflict, but especially during COVID, when people were looking for places to go out near their homes, that was a lot of entertainment for people. And I took these pictures on I think it was May or June, when it was still bright until late. And I saw a whole bunch of people basically filming this beaver feeding on the grass next to the dam. And yeah, I thought it was nice that people were so entertained by urban nature. And that's something I think it's very important to sensitize people for the importance of biodiversity. And I hope that this will somehow change something in their appreciation of nature.
I certainly like the behavior and the look of beavers. I've watched a few TikToks actually about beavers as pets, and they seem to just build dams out of anything in the household. And well, in the wild, I guess they have all the construction material available to them. But it was quite interesting to read about the fact that biodiversity in the cities are great. They also provide that amusement to people and, in a way, a good enjoyment, especially in tough times like the pandemic. But they can also be a double-edged sword, and that you wrote about them causing a bit of problems with local flooding because these beavers were just constructing all these dams in random places along the streams.
Yeah, especially in Switzerland, it was reintroduced, I think, in the 50s or 60s. But since then, it's a very successful species in colonizing also very odd places, let's say, especially in the urban environment, but also in more agriculture areas. Beavers are ecosystem engineers, and so they really create their own living conditions, and that's actually quite good also for other species, but it's not necessarily good for the people who use these streams, who use the land next to the streams, or who build the infrastructure and maintain the infrastructure. Think about dams that, of course, have some important functions.
Arguably very selfish. They're I don't care what happens to the people. I'm just going to build my dam right here.
Well, they create their environment. And I even organized a guided tour with an expert there. And actually, the people who attend these tours, like they're always worried, and are the beavers not sensitive to the water quality? Or like actually the city administration, they cleaned up a bit and removed some of the fallen trees. And then people were worried about the beavers, but actually they're quite fine. Like they find their way through. It's one of the species where we don't have to be concerned.
Okay, but it's still nice to see that the community basically adopts that kind of stewardship towards ecology in the urban space. I've yet to see one in the wild. Maybe I should walk along river stretches more in my pastimes. I think I stick too much to the same river. Maybe I should go exploring a bit. I hear there's some around where I live, but yeah, I look forward to the day I finally encounter one. So these were some photos you took, and it seems like you really have that passion for exploring the outdoors, but also documenting that in a way to show to others. This is just one example. In reading some of the work you've done, you also had an exhibition at some point of some photographs that you took.
Yes. So it's actually not the act of photography that I'm interested in. And also my research, my general interest, represented that I'm quite curious to new things. It's almost unsatisfiable, that I always want to explore new places, venture into new topics. For my research, sometimes it's a bit challenging because I have a bit too many interests maybe. But yeah, it does link well with the things that I did, especially I do a lot of work in tropical countries, but also very close to my house, as we just talked about. And I mean, of course, photography is an important medium to visualize social ecological connections. And I'm very much into visualizations in general, I would say. So that's something that really interests me, together with maps. So maps are one of these visualizations.
And yeah, the role of visual communication is becoming increasingly important. There's no better time than now to really get into honing your skills in that area. I personally believe that too. And we've also had a previous guest on the show, actually episode 3, Martin Guller, who also expressed his passion for maps. And I think there's power in showing that. In your case in particular, a lot of your work, which, as you rightly said, has stretched across the world, actually quite broadly. You've worked in the Congo Basin, you've worked in Zambia, you've also been doing projects in South America.
That was before, yes. Before I went into science, I actually spent quite some time in Central and South America. That was still during my undergrad time. There was one of the big trips to Nicaragua where I had the chance to work in a forest reserve. And the special thing there is, and that's what I like to talk about it, although it's quite some time ago, is that it's actually a cooperative of local farmers who decided together to protect the forest in their watershed. So they realized there's too much deforestation going on, so we protect this area for the benefit of the water that we drink. So it's really a very nice motivation of people to come together and together decide on doing that. And I somehow came across this initiative, and I just asked them, can I do an internship with you? And they said yes, and invited me to come, and I spent 6 months in the reserve and in the rural community there. I actually had to learn Spanish, I didn't speak much before. So, of course, the language was essential to get into this interaction. And what they asked me to do was to create some kind of concept for ecotourism, because they had this reserve and they were thinking, how can we get some income from it? And local tourism already existed, but then they thought, maybe international tourism would be good too. And what I heard, some friends of mine went there actually afterwards, and they told me that it worked out relatively well, because the worry is always with these kind of initiatives, it can get too big or too dependent on this, let's say, foreign income source, and then comes something like COVID, and then all the income is gone. But I think they managed to have a good connection between local, more domestic tourism and some international visitors from time to time.
You're able to balance, I guess, the demands and the potential of using the foreign investments, but then making sure that there's something that the locals can then latch on to and in a way maintain and build up on their own as well.
That was the idea. But I mean, I was a student back then, very inexperienced. And for me, the learning was on my side mostly.
So forestry, was this experience in Nicaragua one of the catalysts for why you ended up deciding to go into forestry? Because I mean, you can map many different aspects.
Not really. And I would actually never say that I went into forestry, because for me, I'm a landscape person. I see different elements in the landscape and I see the interactions with people, and that somehow belongs together more as a system. So I was never a person who said I'm only into forests or I'm only into grasslands or rivers. For me, it somehow belongs together, and it's the interactions and the human users that interest me.
The integrated system.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. But there was a certain attraction of tropical forests, and I mean that came probably from long ago and from some, let's say, idealization as a child or so, when we grew up with, tropical forests are so amazing. And I quickly realized that our image of tropical forest that we have here in Europe has little to nothing to do with what is actually happening, and already the different types and the different regions are so distinct that it doesn't really make sense to actually lump them all together. You may be right that one thing comes to the other, and I had this exposure, and then I actually had the chance for my master's to spend some time in Kenya, in the mountain forest in Mount Kenya.
Okay.
And that was also more on forest regeneration, and from that I came to my PhD subject.
Which was actually a dual degree. You did part of it at AgroParisTech in France and the other part at Bangor Uni in the UK.
That was actually thanks to the European Union. They had this program funded, which was called FONASO, Forest and Nature for Society. And that always involved two host institutions for a co-supervision, and that was AgroParisTech, but actually they sourced it out to CIRAD in Montpellier in France.
Okay.
And it was actually the people from CIRAD, especially my supervisor there, Sylvie Gaulet-Fleury, who unfortunately died recently. But she was very active in the Congo Basin and with these really forestry-related topics. And she came up with this idea, and I was interested, especially because of this combination of remote sensing and fieldwork activities.
And not only that, it felt like the nature and society aspect just perfectly aligned with your worldview that you want to see the system as an integrated system.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. There's always a risk that you strain in too many different aspects, of course, when you approach a question from the systemic point of view. But I would say in this case, it worked out quite well because we had this attachment on the ground, like through my supervisors. And that's what allowed me to actually go there and spend quite some time in the field. And actually, mostly for myself, but also for my publication, that gave much more credibility to these satellite-based observations.
And just to put some context in why you would use remote sensing, and it's not just you didn't look at just the forest themselves, because that wouldn't have the human element, but you look specifically at the activity of logging and the impact it has. Using these satellite imageries, you were able to then detect where the roads were along these different forest areas, and then what would happen to them over time as the activities subsided or even stopped completely.
Mm-hmm. The initial idea, let's say, was to look at how roads spread across the forest. So that's something that is quite well known, and people associate that as one of the main drivers of deforestation. Like once you build a road into an intact forest, there will be settlements around, there will be all kind of human land use, and that will first degrade and then in the end lead to complete deforestation.
As you rightfully said, roads are often used as sort of the indicators for human activities. Mm-hmm. And I guess it's also one of the things you immediately see when you look at a landscape. You see where the roads are pulled through. Even when you don't have a city, if you're trying to see what the impact is on the landscape, those are really the first kinds of features you come to. I guess just to cite some stats from a paper of yours, which I thought was very interesting and just puts things into perspective. So in a way, the annual growth rate of roads in forests for these activities, you quote at around 40 kilometers of new road built per 10,000 square kilometers of forest area.
For those forests which are laid out for logging. It's a control process where the government gives a concession to a company and then allows them to actually take out trees. But it's actually on average only 2 trees per hectare. So it's a highly selective activity, the logging that happens there.
I mean, that's not a lot at all if you think how big a hectare is and how dense a forest is.
Exactly. It's very few, but it's because they target only a few very valuable species. And the big disadvantage of this activity is that they need access to these areas. So the trees are somewhere, let's say, in this hectare. And I mean, first you need to find them, but for this they have teams to look for them. But then they need to build a road to actually access the area with the machinery and everything. And these roads do cause problems, definitely. But the interesting thing that I found and that I document was that these roads are abandoned after only 1 or 2 years of these logging activities. And they actually, in well-managed concessions, they actually overgrow very quickly. And that's what I showed in several of my papers, both based on remote sensing, on satellite data, and on the ground, showing that the forest actually recovers very quickly on these roads if you let it grow. So that's the key point with all kind of forest restoration and natural regeneration. It happens just like this, but people need to allow it to happen. And one aspect of this is, of course, to close the road properly and not allow any uses afterwards.
Yeah.
There's a lot of social implications, and I didn't look into detail with that because, for example, there's some indigenous communities in the forests and they actually also need some roads for their activities and they want to have access to certain areas. But overall, like what we showed is that once the forest recovers on the roads, let's say the ecological quality is quite high again. And species that like elephants and gorillas and chimpanzees that live in this area, like they actually come back straight away. So their populations are not affected by the road building in itself.
So in a way, we pull these roads through the forests for these activities. Some of your work also goes deeper into the details. Normally there's one primary road, like it's a dominant road, and then a lot of secondary roads that sort of sprout out from there, usually ending up in dead ends. These roads are not your traditional roads that you see in cities. They're actually dirt roads, where the key is also how wide they are built as well. They need to be wide enough for access by all this machinery, but you also caution against building them too wide. Nevertheless, once the activities are done, in a way you found that the re-establishment of the nature around these roads are often, as you said, better in terms of density, the biomass that sort of accumulates around there. So in a way, it seems like the effect is not that strong. It's not that terrible, but there is a subtlety to what you found. It's not all, happy and happy-go-lucky.
Mm-hmm. But that's exactly what I'm advocating with my research is that not any road built into a forest or built in any natural area has the same impact. And very often when we rely on general satellite-based assessment, that's all we have. Like we just see, oh, there's a road or there's no road. And then all kind of global assessments, like for example, global intact forests are assessed only based on that. And one very important argument that I have is look at how a road is actually used. And of course, that requires more effort. Like we have to look a bit more into detail, like road network hierarchy, but of course also ideally on some kind of traffic counts, which then satellites will not help us so much with anymore. But that's one of the main take-home messages for my research, that it just doesn't make sense to use any road as an indicator for the same human impact.
Yeah, there are nuances to a lot of the findings. I guess they'll also be quite challenging to spot from a satellite image, right? How do you go about searching for these features in the satellite image? Are they quite obvious?
Yes. So it was only possible because they are quite obvious. And that's because of the big difference. Once a new road is built, you have the bare ground and a linear feature.
Yeah.
And that comes out relatively clearly compared to the more or less closed canopy forest around it. But that is mostly for the human eye. So basically anyone can look at these images and they see patterns there, like they see linear features. It gets much more tricky when you try to automate this process. And that was actually an initial idea of my PhD. And I know that, this is like more than 10 years ago that I actually started working on that. And I decided not to go for the automated detection, but I did everything manual. So I spent hours and hours delineating roads on satellite images on the screen.
Oof, that would have been a bit of an activity.
But it was fun. It somehow can get a bit meditative. And it was a PhD after all, so I could invest some time in that. But I know that now, and people regularly contact me who still want to work on the automation of this. Now with machine learning, and I think there's some AI tasks that really have evolved since then and think they're on a good way of doing that. But for me, it was always like, I'm not a remote sensing person at the
core
or at the technique, let's say.
Yeah.
For me, it's always like, it gives me interesting observations, but that tells me something about the processes that are happening and that supports decision making. And that's what I'm interested in. And that's why I spent relatively little time getting this data. And I also wanted to support it with ground data. But then I was much more interested in like, what does this data tell us and what can we learn from it also for management? Out of this, for example, I later on worked together with the forest certification body FSC, who were very interested in solving a big issue that they're still facing actually, with the intact forest landscape protection. And my kind of more detailed data gave important evidence in understanding that different roads have different impacts and how to actually differentiate them.
And that was an interesting continuation of what you had already established, this idea of now working with a bit of that governance or regulation system around the forest industry. So I guess first of all, to clarify, you used the term intact forest landscapes. So forests that are fairly untouched by the roads. And in order to undertake, as far as I understand, the logging practice or any kind of modification practice, there's a certification system.
Yes. So the certification system is for the wood.
Okay.
So it's for people who buy wood or any kind of paper products, and they can look for sustainably produced wood. So that was already invented in the early 90s, I think.
Yeah.
Like a couple of NGOs together teamed up with the industry and with also like social organizations, trade unions, to form this FSC certification scheme.
What does FSC stand for?
The Forest Stewardship Council.
Forest Stewardship Council. Okay.
And back then, I think the tropical forests were really at the core of their concern. One big concern was, and that still is, we want to protect tropical forests for all kinds of reasons, biodiversity, carbon stocks, and so on. But we cannot demand from tropical countries to just make everything a national park.
Yeah.
Just because it creates opportunity costs to the country to set aside large areas which they cannot make any money with.
And then to maintain, administrate, protect.
Exactly. So it needs to come from somewhere. And one of the key ideas is, why not we use the forest sustainably? That means we take out some wood. We make sure that this is not too much, that it doesn't deteriorate, but it basically follows a natural cycle. And FSC, in a way, is the label that certifies that this activity is happening in a sustainable way. And they do this like through regular audits, and like they have set up these standards like also for different regions. But they are criticized heavily. And Greenpeace actually used to be a member of FSC for a long time.
Okay.
And it's like a very democratic system how it's set up. They invited me once to their general assemblies, and it's very interesting how the decision making goes. Everyone has a say, and everyone can put in so-called motions with new kind of regulations or new principles. And one of these very important motions was actually in 2014, and that was to protect intact forests as part of the FSC system.
Okay.
And that was actually voted for by 90% of the members, and also the logging companies themselves are members. But nobody thought about that they actually signed a bit of a conundrum there. Because when you want to certify wood, like you need to cut the wood first. And the whole system only works if you have wood to sell, which then you can put the label on.
Yeah, that sounds kind of ironic.
And if now you say, well, now the certification scheme should protect intact forests, which by definition should not be used or touched by any human, then you have a big issue because you cannot do both in the same area. And the workaround that they were thinking, well, then we divide it. Like then we have some production forest and we have some intact forest. But economically, that's very challenging to achieve for a private company because they need to make a certain amount of money. And already through the certification rules, they make a bit less. But there remains a gap which they are not able to fill. And that's why once the companies realized that, took them a while, they said, well, we cannot do this new regulation. And if it will be there, they have to drop out of the whole scheme. And then the question is always, what is the alternative once those companies are not there anymore? Then other non-certified companies can take over the same forest and do the operations without any control, let's say.
And you stepped into this kind of conundrum or this kind of interesting regulation story with a piece of work that I would say didn't quite help the cause, but kind of gave them another piece of realization, which was you investigated the situations around these regulated versus the unregulated forests and actually found that it seems like the impact was worse in the regulated areas compared to the unregulated ones.
Yes, in a way, but only if you look at the impact purely based on the roads.
Yeah.
Because my data was based on the road, which is the same actually with the definition of intact forest. And since then that has in so far evolved, like there's other people working more in detail on that, looking more at what animals are in the different areas. And they found quite different results. So my results are actually only based on the satellite observations. But what I could provide to that, and that links back to my core findings of my PhD, is that maybe the whole way how intactness is assessed is an issue because it's a global scale assessment where you kind of really in a binary way say, oh, this is intact, this is not intact, just based on a buffer around a road.
Yeah.
And that is very strongly simplified. And what I could provide is to show, well, actually, these roads disappear relatively quickly. And then in a way, they could be considered intact again, just not by the very kind of strict interpretation. And this realization, in a way, helped to actually get the discussion running in a much more open way, because before it was really like Greenpeace was here and the companies were there and they were kind of like
yelling at each other.
There was no way to compromise, and like it helped to have a bit of a different view. But at the core, of course, is that you need people to understand their positions, and that's why we are now in a process already lasting quite a while, which is more about social aspects and bringing people together and actually discussing what are the solutions. And that's the way forward now also for FSC. They will not completely drop the whole idea of intactness, but they will look at it in a more
holistic
dynamic way.
Dynamic way. Actually, that's a better word to describe it. I always tend to use holistic. I think it's important to see multiple angles of a problem. But you got to consider the dynamism in this. It's not just about how the forest looks today. I think there's, any kind of processes in the biosphere are better observed from that dynamic angle.
And my approach to ecology itself is very dynamic.
Yeah.
We need to let go of certain ideals, because of course we like the idea of like ancient forests untouched by humans, no? Like in a way that resonates in us, creates a feeling. But in the world that we live, we need to think a bit, I would say, beyond that. And we need to think of different ways of integrating human, even infrastructures into ecological processes. And that's something where I moved on since then, actually.
So you finished your PhD in 2016, and now you're in Zurich, and you'll be actually moving on to a new position at the start of next year. But what was the opportunity that sprung upon you and made you decide to then come to Zurich?
Interesting question, because I cannot even tell exactly. I was in Zurich at a conference, I think in 2015, and I got to know the ecosystem management group where I'm still in now.
Here at ETH Zurich.
Here at ETH. And I thought they were doing fascinating stuff because people do have a bit of ecological background, but they ventured very strongly into the social sphere, let's say, and we think about social ecological systems with a variety of methods. And I knew about that, and I think I got to know Jabril Ghazul, who's still my current professor, and then he announced this postdoc position on quite a different subject, actually. It was more on the water energy food nexus.
Okay.
But I was still able to, let's say, bring in some of these ideas of, let's call it reconciliation ecology into the topic. It was a challenge, I have to say, because how the project was set up was a very different way of thinking. It came more out of the hydrological modeling side. And what we brought into this was actually species invasions as part of the hydrological changes. So together with the water chemistry group, we did quite some interesting work linking, again, satellite observations of floating plant invasions with water quality measurements on the ground.
Yeah. So not quite algal blooms, even more than that. It's actual plants that have established themselves on lakes and rivers.
Yes, mostly on rivers. And we were particularly looking at dammed rivers because these plants, they need more still waters. So there are also big populations on lakes, but we were looking at dammed reservoirs. It's a fascinating plant. It's very abundant across the tropics, even subtropics, like the water hyacinth.
I've heard of those.
Some people call them one of the world's worst invasive species.
I hear they make good furniture.
You can make really interesting stuff out of them.
I think growing up in Asia myself, I think I've seen more water hyacinth furnitures than I've actually seen water hyacinths, but... Yeah.
Then maybe you haven't been out so much.
I'm really not painting a good picture of myself at the moment, am I?
Must be the weather.
Okay, I'll blame the weather. Blame external factors.
I mean, once you see it, you know it. I think it's it's very pretty. Actually, people brought it in for gardening purposes because it has very nice white purple hyacinth flowers. Mm-hmm. But it reproduces very fast and it can colonize entire water surfaces within no time.
Okay, and does this have an impact on the water itself? I guess they need nutrients, and shading would be the biggest one. They would basically remove any light penetrating into the water bodies, but any other known key impacts?
So why we got into that was actually because hydropower operators were complaining about it because it's a physical obstruction to their turbines.
Yeah, I guess wouldn't be nice.
And the problem with the dams is that wherever these plants grow, they would float down and then they would accumulate at the dam. And then you have huge carpets of these floating plants. And that's, of course, exactly where the water intake is for the dam. And they have big issues with it. And I see that. And they mechanically reduce it. So what at some point we suggest, why don't you harvest these plants and then make biogas of it? So kind of
completing the cycle in a way.
Link the dam and then put a biogas facility next to it. As far as I know, it didn't happen yet. I think there are logistical challenges with it. But yeah, that is one of the biggest issues, actually, that obstructs all kind of activities, like also fisheries, things like that.
Okay, so a real nuisance.
Of course, the shading also creates issues. But what is important and what we showed again through more long-term perspective, so that links actually to my previous work, that satellite observations gave us like the opportunity to look at long-term time series of these invasions.
The dynamism, as you mentioned earlier, the importance of it.
Exactly, and to show that very few places in the world have permanent cover of this. Like it's actually coming and going with the seasons, with the change in rainfall. And that already is important because this dynamic allows the system to also regenerate in between. And the other thing that we showed, and that was again like the more surprising part, was that these plants actually provide a service to the people who live there because they are some kind of spontaneous sewage system.
Not just furniture.
They are not just furniture or baskets or all kind of things that you can make of them, but they actually take up a lot of nutrients from the water. And the precondition for them to grow is that there are a lot of nutrients. So they grew preferably at places where untreated wastewater enters from cities especially.
So they could almost act like indicators for pollution or for just high nutrient concentrations. So it's almost like a tool you can use, not just in a way a potential resource or a beautification example. But there are a lot of positives associated with the prevalence of water hyacinths.
Yeah, if the indicator in itself is positive, but they do change the water quality. And we showed that based on field measurements, that when they're there, they actually take up quite some of the phosphorus and nitrogen.
Okay.
And that is somehow an ecosystem service that is unaccounted for because the focus in the whole context of invasive species is very much on the disservices, which are clearly there. And like I acknowledge that. But I think it's important to look at both sides.
No, it's very interesting. It, in a way, allows you to move from forest areas to a very different kind of ecosystem in the water space as well. And then engaging with using nature as a tool to help deliver, as you said, these ecosystem services in different environments as well. I guess one thing that's been on my mind this whole time, it seems that the one common thread in your journey has been working in the tropics. Has there been a particular reason or personal passion for that, or has that been the opportunities of the projects and where we need to understand these processes better geographically?
Good question, because it was never a constant choice. Like, it's not that let's say I have the globe in front of me and I say, oh, I want to go there and I want to go there. It's like one thing comes to the other. But of course, there was a very early fascination for the tropics, and I just went for opportunities. I should mention that what I studied in my undergrad, landscape planning, was very much focused on the German context. Like it's quite specific, let's say, on environments there and on even like legal frameworks that are provided there, like environmental impact assessments, for example, and all kind of very specific tools adapted to the German context. Like, for example, Germany had already one of the pioneers, like already in the 70s, they had a whole no net loss of biodiversity framework. But that requires a very strict legal framework, which we learned about during our undergrad, and which is not easy to apply to other regions.
And not only mention that, your passion for nature conservation also came or was partly motivated by you actually living on an island off the German coast for a whole year.
And that was right after school.
Okay.
That was actually my civil service. So I had to, replacement of military service. I went to work as a national park guard. And that was a huge privilege, but also a huge opportunity for me to actually escape my a bit provincial, suburban teenager life. I mean, I was 19 when I then had the opportunity to spend one whole year on this island with very nice people, who were like-minded and had this same kind of passion for being outside and being in nature, but also really have a purposeful thing to do. I really felt this was important. Although, let's say we were part of a small monitoring program, like every 2 weeks we had to go out and count all the birds that were migrating through the island.
So you take binoculars and you start to look at them and figure out who is who.
Yeah, exactly. Like you really look for which species is there and then you count them by species. The advantage there is that they come in groups, and this area there is the Waddensee, it's a big marshland, let's say, which runs dry when the tide is low. And then these, especially migrating birds, stop by there and get all kind of worms and stuff out of the ground. And that's where they gather. And then we look through our binoculars, but we also have bigger scopes. And then we counted them and recorded them. So that was one aspect. And the other aspect was to do mapping of breeding birds in the breeding season. So we kind of walked through every little corner of this island to look for breeding birds, and then we drew it on the map. But we also gave guided tours and did some maintenance in the national park. So that was a really exciting and amazing opportunity for me to get into very practical conservation work.
Sounds like an incredible experience.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, it was still like my first work experience after school, like to be out there and quite independent. Like we lived next to the lighthouse in a small hut.
Oh, wow.
But remote from any town, and basically had to do this all on our own. And there, of course, like because it's a national park, there's people living permanently on that island, but also a lot of tourists coming in. And that made me realize that it doesn't work to just put a fence around nature and leave people out, because there is a lot of interests from the people who traditionally lived there, and they did fishing and they did all kind of activities. But of course, also tourists and people want to enjoy nature for recreation. And in a way, within limits, like you need to allow them to do that, also to build a connection with nature, because not everyone had the privilege to actually work there and be paid for it.
And you actually touch upon a key point that in a way really shows where you are now and currently in your research trajectory. You sort of went from the forests to the rivers, inspired by the bird watching, but you're looking at the urban spaces now, and in particular, the transition from cities to rural areas. It's often a very blurred kind of thing. You don't just say, here's the end of the city, and you see a very clear, distinct change in landscape. As you said, we don't put a fence around nature, yet sometimes I think we see examples of that happening. You've always looked at the interplay between the humans and the nature, but you're looking at it really where it's happening in the most, I guess, dominant sense, which is the urban space.
Yeah, because I don't really make that differentiation. Like, this is only urban, this is only rural. In the end, what it's about is about infrastructure. It's about built infrastructure which facilitates human uses. And that's something already on that island, like to pick up from there. There were a lot of pressures, of course, to build infrastructure. Particularly in that area, they have now built large offshore wind farms.
Okay.
To do the big energy transition. I mean, Germany was leading in that. I mean, now they're having some issues getting it done. But yeah, already back then, there was in the early 2000s, they created these first offshore wind parks. But the problem they had, like, they needed to get the electricity on land. So huge cables to get through. And one of those cables went straight through our islands, actually.
That's insane.
And that was actually in the planning when I was there. But that made me realize, oh, wow, like we have two objectives here. Like, I'm very much in favor of renewable energies, but I'm also very much in favor of protecting my island. And so how do we do it? And again, there were compromise solutions. Like they actually made like an engineering solution to build the cable under the whole island without digging everything open. And they had some restoration schemes in other parts of the island to actually restore natural areas. So that already brought me in this infrastructure theme. And then when I decided I want to study something with ecology, but I don't want to be purely on the biology side. Like I want to study this integration. I want to study the interaction between people and nature. And that brought me into the landscape planning, which is really a career, let's say.
Yeah.
And that brought me to Berlin. And Berlin is all about urban nature. I'm going there because that was really my first inspiration and very important source of inspiration also for now to think about urban ecosystems, because Berlin is in so far an amazing city because after the war and after the wall came down, there were a lot of vacant space. And if you go there, or especially when you went there 20 years ago, like you saw huge forests that have grown on abandoned railway, for example. And a very big source of inspiration until now was my professor Ingo Kovarik, who's like a professor of urban ecology and vegetation science in Berlin. And through him, like I learned that actually some of the wildest forests I can imagine, they're growing right in the city on an area that until 60 years ago was still a railway station.
Vegetation taking back nature. Yeah, it reminds me of a discussion I had back in episode 6 with our guest who worked on rural species, Ari Arab Shahi. You can check it out, listeners, if you're interested in a project he did. But there's a saying that the nature will take back its space eventually if you let it. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's a fascinating topic because there's a certain beauty to it in nature and abandoned places.
And that's one of the key realizations that I had back then, that it's not static. Things can grow back. And that is then a theme that went through all the different topics that we talked about. So far away it may be, but like it was about the roads, it was about the dams. It's always vegetation that takes over and that then helps deliver certain services to people again. And of course, in the urban sphere, that's particularly important. And that's why the nature-based solutions idea works especially well in the urban sphere, when we talk about forest restoration, for example, that's also often considered a nature-based solution to climate change. There's a lot of criticism of this term, and I'm myself very critical about using this because it's too simple.
Yeah, and it's not one that you think about using much in urban areas, whereas actually you can. Urban spaces can be large enough to house these forests. In fact, I've seen examples of tiny forests where they actually build miniaturized versions using different kinds of species. So yeah, I think nature-inspired, nature-based. I usually ask my guests what their preferred term is, but it's clear from how you've expressed it. And also given your broader background of the landscape, I think, yeah, something that doesn't make sense at first when you think about how it would work, but there are ways.
Exactly. Like I think in the urban sphere, it's very important to mainstream this concept because I think there's quite a wide agreement, especially across, I guess, your guests in your podcast, that we do need more natural features in the urban sphere. But of course, there's a certain trade-off because we also want to densify cities to avoid urban sprawl because it's kind of scientifically shown many times that it's better to concentrate human impacts rather than spread them out. But that's the key question, like how can we use natural features in denser cities? And that's something I became very interested. There again, COVID was really like the, let's say, the impetus, but also a bit of a window of opportunity for me to really get back into thinking about this and also to realizing, well, maybe only working in the tropics was a bit problematic because it's so much dependent on me flying, on me
being there in person,
going to remote places because I have this background in urban ecology, but that really alerted me of, maybe to go back into it. And that then my whole work on the importance of urban green space during COVID and since COVID came about.
And this is your most cited paper and simple but very impactful study because you in a way looked at people's desire to go out during the lockdowns and using a very simple tool which we can all access, which is Google Trends. And you tracked what people were searching for in terms of wanting to walk and going for a walk. And you saw a notable increase in wanting to use green spaces despite authorities and governments actually closing down these places in certain areas. I myself have looked at the Google mobility data and I could see a significant increase in green space usage as well during pretty much the whole pandemic period. But in a way you highlight, in a way there's an opportunity now to really rethink about how we design nature in cities and the importance of green space and the importance we assign to green spaces in urban areas.
Yes, I should say like the methodology that I chose was really born out of, let's say, the emergency. It was already in the first weeks of the first lockdown where I realized, oh, wow, there's something happening here. Of course, it was also combined with the weather, but like people really went out of their homes into the parks like crazy. And then the whole reaction was, oh, then the city of Zurich, for example, decided, oh, let's close these parks because people are coming too close to each other. And all these things, which I think many of us have very vivid memory. These were somehow super scary, but also exciting times. And realizing that, oh, there's really something changing in the relationship between people and the environment here. And so I put this methodology together, just using Google Trends and showing this peak in interest. And I mean, this paper is like a commentary, like it's what we published right at the start. And there's now many different studies, and I'm currently working on it. I just submitted a review paper on all the different studies about what happened in the relationship between people and green space during that time and since then. And the Google Trends was very, like, let's say, the first method that was at hand. But actually in that review, I even threw out my own paper because there's much more reliable, methodologies to...
a humbling experience, I guess.
Well, we were a bit strict about study quality, let's say. And it was more about the idea and getting that out. And that also helped getting these citations now. It's still not an amazing amount, but it's compared to my other more niche papers. I think that was something that really resonated with a much wider audience, let's say.
But I think it's good practice for a researcher to be self-critical and also evaluate their own studies with a fresh approach. Very commendable. And in a way, it shows that self-critical reflection, but also the adaptability that you need to have, especially during tough times like the pandemic.
Yeah, and in a way, I published this first paper, but I didn't really jump on that train straight away. Like I didn't write any grant applications on the topic because I somehow felt, well, there's more important things in pandemic response than this topic.
Yeah.
But now it still makes sense like to bring it all together and get this overview.
But nevertheless, this in a way, along with the forestry, along with everything you've looked at in different contexts, comes down to this one term, which you mentioned before, but I think really is where you want to head, where you're going, and what we must do in the world, which is reconciliation ecology. What do you define as reconciliation ecology?
Well, first of all, it's not me who invented it. It was Rosenzweig, or in the early 2000s, who came up with this term, which is a bit of a realization that if we want to conserve biodiversity, we need area. Like there's a direct link between the available area for species and the biodiversity. And the typical way to get this area is to make reserves, like protected areas. So that's reservation ecology, or to restore areas in some kind of perceived natural states, which is then restoration ecology. But for that, it needs the land, and it's very important that we have this land, actually. Like, it's very important that we do this. But reconciliation ecology is a bit a reaction to, well, there are certain areas where we cannot free the land because we need it for human uses. And that is, of course, very common in agriculture. Agroecology is direct reaction to that, to maintain certain species on agricultural used land, which is a bit problematic for me, and that's not exactly the topic that I'm working on, because there's a very strong argument which comes from the land sharing, land sparing divide, which is a very big discussion for a while in the conservation scene. Actually, the advocates of the land sparing have shown very strong evidence that it's actually better to intensify agriculture, to get more yields, and instead spare other land and completely protect it. So that's why in the agriculture sphere, it's a bit difficult, let's say, to reduce yields for the purpose of certain species, because overall we may need more land, which then is missing for other things. That aspect of reconciliation ecology is a bit tricky, but I'm mostly interested in the human infrastructure part. And there, I think the land that it takes to build infrastructure is occupied anyways. Like, it's difficult to do that differently. And there's my approach to actually improve, especially vegetation in those areas, overtake certain infrastructure functions by vegetation or by unbuilt areas. That's one key aspect that I'm interested in.
This reflects another term that I've heard, which is a lot more prevalent in the architectural discipline, which is cohabitation. So man's coexistence with nature and the mutual cooperation, I guess, between the two to create a sustainable environment for both, livable, but also sustainable for nature.
Yeah, I think it goes in the same direction. Just from an ecology side, of course, you have certain other objectives. Like, I don't know if biodiversity in itself is so important in the cohabitation, or also I think you talk a lot about blue-green infrastructure. I'm not sure if biodiversity is one of the key purposes there, or if it's actually more about also important things like stormwater or climate regulation.
People get confused by it because there's so many different terms that describe it, hence why I've asked my previous guests how they describe it. But I use blue-green infrastructures and nature-based solutions in a way, not interchangeably, but I say one is a subset of the other. So blue-green infrastructures being a subset, or within that category with some nuanced differences. But biodiversity is very much part of it, because it's about thinking about how we can use nature for the various ecosystem services, the multifunctionality. And if we can equally weight some of these purposes, of course, oftentimes one will dominate the other. And you have to think about that, because it's about design and what is important. And this is where I think stakeholders also play a role again. Then you will design for that. But where you can maximize the benefits of others to the best of your ability, your investment, I think that should be done. Space is scarce. There's space competition. We need to be able to use the space wisely. And I think this relates a lot to also some of the challenges you tackled in the urban areas, where it's also about that space.
It's about space, and I try not to talk about win-win solutions, because I don't really believe that exists. Like, there's always trade-offs and there's always winners and losers, because the space is, you can use it wisely and you can share it, but it's not everyone who gets the same benefits out of it. And that's one of the things, and you mentioned stakeholder, like, of course, we need to bring in different people in this agenda. And that's something I was very interested in different tools of doing that. And one of them is visualization. We talked about it earlier.
Yeah.
And, one thing I came up with, and that's, again, a different topic, but that's the whole use of drone imagery.
And that's actually how we got on to discussing and having conversations when we first met back at the World Biodiversity Forum in Davos a year ago. And you actually presented some very interesting work that you did flying a drone and using dronography to test different ways of viewing a landscape with stakeholders and to see how that affects their decision making, or at least their judgment of a particular situation. First of all, I enjoy flying a drone too. I bought bought a drone a year and a half ago. And I've had some beautiful flights with it. Although I did not recently anymore, it's been about 6 months. I crashed it into the river. Luckily, I fished it out. It was just on the other side of Zurich in the open areas. And I misjudged the distance a bit, but it's safe. I got a new battery to replace it, and I have to fix the propellers. But I've had my fair share of experiences with it. What's your experience like?
You mean with drone flying in itself? It's actually very funny because I mentioned earlier, like, I'm not interested in the technical parts of remote sensing, which includes satellites, but also includes drones. But I was in this Water Energy Food Nexus project, and they had hired or included in the proposal a company doing drone flights.
Okay.
And that was very interesting for me because I didn't have to worry about the technical side, because there was a whole company from the UK who had all kind of different drones at their disposal. And they just asked, oh, what do you want to do with it?
Oh, handy.
But what they also underestimated, and I mean, I was completely blank on this, was that our project took place in Zambia and in Ethiopia. Our Ethiopian partners said straight away, oh no, it's completely impossible to fly a drone in this country.
Because they had airspace restrictions and
exactly.
things like that. Yeah.
But our partners in Zambia were actually quite interested. But then once it came closer, like all kind of regulations appeared, which showed, it's actually very difficult to really make it happen. I mean, I commend the effort of our drone company partner who went there even like a week early to go through even like bringing the drone into the country was already very difficult.
Okay.
Not to speak about flying it. And then all the paperwork also our partners at the University of Zambia had to do. In the end, we had a military colonel with us the whole time observing every single flight we did.
Oh, wow. So, talk about control.
And I mean, he was very nice when he didn't bother, but like for the protocol, like, he had to be there the whole time. And it was, of course, complicated to make this happen. And drone flying in itself is already a bit of a challenge because you're so sensitive to the weather, for example. So we couldn't fly when there's too much wind, when there's rain at all. But also, like, we had the drone come down because of sun, actually, because it was just too hot.
Oh, jeez. So it overheated while in midair.
It overheated while it was in the air. Exactly. So these things are there anyways, but then we had all these regulations to follow, which made it very challenging. And I mean, I'm happy that I didn't have to arrange for this. And I mean, there were like crazy situations where we were flying next to a bridge because we were looking for this floating vegetation that I mentioned earlier.
Okay, yeah.
And they happened to be clocked on that bridge. And so we thought, let's fly the drone here.
To zoom in, of course.
And then we parked the car a bit on the side of the river from the bridge, and we just left, actually. And then a military truck parked next to it, and they jumped out with their machine guns, and they...
What?
I was actually driving at the time, and like...
Oh my God.
And they came with their guns, and they stopped us from kind of driving out of this road.
Were you in like a military facility or a military zone, or?
Well, actually, I mean, we realized after that bridges, because there's not many bridges crossing the Zambezi River. Actually the Kafue River it was. Yeah. There's not many bridges crossing any river, basically. And this bridge was a very kind of neuralgic point. So they had a military base right next to it. Oh, okay. And it seems they kind of observed us, and then they kind of stopped us from leaving and wanted to search everything.
Oh my God.
But actually, like, the drone operator, like, he used to be in the military before. So he gave me, because I was driving and I didn't kind of know what to do. And then he said, stop, handbrake, get out. And then we really had to kind of leave the car, go like hands up, and like we're not doing anything. But then luckily we had this colonel with us. He was sitting in the back of the car, and he was showing his idea, and that kind of helped solve these issues. But the first moment, like, to have this machine gun pointed at you,
it's not a nice feeling. I've never experienced it, thank God, but still. Wow.
That was quite tense situation.
I mean, after the fact, you can amuse yourself with it. I guess, one of those comical scenes that could have happened, at least that was floating through my head, was that your colonel was fast asleep in the back. But it all worked out in the end.
It worked, and we were happy that we had a colonel with us. We were quite annoyed in the beginning because like we had to hire him, we had to pay him, and so on. But there was this situation where we thought, sometimes good to have someone. Like
it paid off in the end.
Although he didn't give a damn about the drone flying. So.
Well, I guess, that's one part of the experience. And I guess, the question comes, how far would you go for your data? And this was definitely an adventure.
Well, if you tell me before, I wouldn't go. I wouldn't go this road.
Would you like to go get some data? You'll be escorted by the military. You may encounter more military, and you have to be, very strategic in how you handle things.
Yeah, but the whole idea of using the drones for something completely different, because it was kind of planned to use it more for natural observations, like to observe the vegetation, to observe the river, and to look at flow of the river and things like that. But it was very interesting because we spent a week or so with students from the local university, and they all had picked places that they're interested in. And we went to all kind of different places to fly the drone there. But already during this exercise, I realized that some of them had difficulty, even without a drone, identifying where we are on the map or on Google satellite view, which they had on their phone. But then it became clear to me that they are not all trained in actually identifying, because I asked them, where do you want to fly the drone? They said, somewhere there, pointing at the landscape. But then I asked them, can you point it here on the map? And then it wasn't always possible for them.
Okay.
And that kind of revealed that not everyone has the same access to spatial information. And only once we had produced these drone images that actually helped us to discuss about completely different aspects of the landscape. And that inspired then this paper, which we kind of focused the research on later on. Like we had all this drone imagery, which is quite nice that we had different types of drone imagery from the same place. So we had more like a high resolution mapping drone, which looks straight down in nadir perspective. But we also had more of a video drone taking side views of the landscape, which then adds a third dimension.
In a way, you looked at the two ways of viewing things, which is nadir, so really from the top down, as if you go to Google Maps and you turn on satellite, that's what you would see. But you also looked at oblique, viewing things at an angle. So in case listeners, you've never tried it, go to Google Earth and actually try moving your mouse and rotating, I think it's with the wheel. You can actually have like a bird's eye view rather than a top-down view of the landscape. And I think that's quite interesting, where these two different viewpoints actually are very different in how people perceive the landscape, and that people who maybe don't have as much experience with maps and reading things from the top down, they actually more easily recognize these oblique view pictures.
Exactly. We did a bit of an experimental setting. Not many replications, unfortunately. Now I have master students working on that more in detail. But we just brought a Google satellite view, which is a high-resolution satellite, but it's still quite coarse. Then we had the high-resolution drone image, which shows up to 2 centimeters of detail. And we had this very cheap video drone, which has the advantage that it can look at from the side. I printed out these pictures and I showed them to different people. And then I just asked them to label what they see on the landscape. For most of them, they didn't know the landscape. And then I just counted the number of elements. And what was expected was that it increased from the, let's say, lower resolution to the high resolution, but then it increased further to the oblique, to the side view, across all stakeholders. But then what was particularly striking was that the small-scale farmers who had no previous training or experience in using maps or using aerial imagery, they had very low rates of identification in the straight-down nadir view, just because it has nothing to do with their reality on the ground.
Yeah.
But then once we introduced the oblique view from the video drone, then they were actually almost on the same level with all the other stakeholders, which were like administrators or also large-scale farmers who even use these kind of maps for their work.
Which in a way highlights the importance of making sure everyone has a solid understanding of the problem. And that might mean catering to their worldview before you engage in decision-making, group discussions, things like that.
Yes, exactly. And it's a way of empowerment of people who are normally not included in the discussion.
Yeah.
Or even if you have a multi-stakeholder discussion, then very often people would just put, here's the map or here's the satellite view. Now we know everything. Let's discuss. And very often people don't even know what they don't know.
That is true.
There's people excluded from the discussion, although everyone assumes, we have the information here. And that's why I make a strong argument there that we need diverse viewpoints and perspectives, also visually, in such processes.
Incredibly fascinating how you've worked both in the ecological space, but also the social space, in now really integrating the two in what we refer to nowadays as socio-ecological systems. And we've discussed beaver dams through rivers, we've discussed roads through forests, we've discussed cables through islands. In a way, it's all come back from forests all the way to the urban areas. You've had such a diverse portfolio. Where are you heading next?
Yeah, it's actually, I like how you describe it because I like diversity of topics. And I started with this, that I'm super curious for new things.
I thought you meant lines through landscapes, but okay.
But I think one thing that holds it a bit together is what I talked about, like the infrastructure and the reconciliation with ecological systems. But the other thing that holds it together is spatial analysis. And that is my next step. My assistant professorship that I will start soon will be about spatial analysis and land use science. And that will allow me to bring together some of these strains. And yeah, one of the exciting things coming up soon is this project on river daylighting, which we are both involved in.
A chance to collaborate, yeah.
Will be a nice chance to work together, exactly. And that in a way is, again, the process of a very highly, let's say, human-modified system. It's all concrete infrastructure when you put a river into a tunnel or into a culvert. And I'm really fascinated by this idea of taking it out of that culvert and putting it back to the daylight and then allowing
naturalizing it
again. And we're currently in the decade of ecosystem restoration of the United Nations. And I think that's one of the very interesting examples for restoration, which brings all kind of benefits because it happens in the urban sphere. And I would claim that people are very excited about rivers and streams in the urban area. Like it really attracts people. But of course, it also allows other species to grow and biodiversity to recover in the urban sphere. And of course, it brings all these benefits that you know much more about, like stormwater retention, but also climate retention like this. I would say the water brings cooling with it to the urban sphere.
I was going to say, I'm glad you said cooling because apart from stormwater, I think what you reminded me more of is that it hasn't cooled down yet. It's still warm out here in Zurich. But nevertheless, you're right. I think it's something that we have a chance to look at, and I'm excited as well to see what comes out of that project. But yeah, most certainly that spatial analysis to really support stakeholders, support the planning, and congratulations again on your new position. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how you progress in that and the new exciting research that you'll produce as well.
Thanks.
Fritz, it's been fascinating looking at your journey across all the different aspects that you've covered from all the different lines across landscapes. I'd like to ask you a few questions that I ask all my guests on the show. And we've heard a lot about all the different inspirations that have driven you in giving you that passion for outdoors, for nature, for conservation. So instead, I'm going to ask you if you had a magic wand. So if you could change one thing overnight, instantly, about the current situation we're in, what would you change and why?
Well, if it's a completely irrational want, then I would create a world where you can go from one place to another without emitting CO2 or harming the environment in other ways, because that's one of the biggest challenges, because I like traveling and I very much enjoy going to other places. But from the beginning, actually, I felt this, what is called flying shame in German.
Flying shame, okay.
Flugscham in German.
Interesting.
And if there's any way to overcome that, that would be amazing. Because I very much believe in exchange. I think if we want a different world, we need to be in contact with people from other cultures, from other regions. And that cannot be replaced just remotely. Like it needs to happen through personal interactions. And if that would be possible without harming the environment, like that would be just amazing.
Yeah, that would be certainly very cool. Yeah, it would enable travel to a lot more places, especially remote ones as well, which I think have a lot of pristine beauty and nature still intact.
Well, of course, you wouldn't want to overdo it because at some point it's not intact anymore.
Ecotourism redefined.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe it's good to have a cost to it, but there shouldn't be such a high environmental cost. Let's say.
Okay, but we'll call it practical logistics, but yes, at a cost that we should be bearing. Nevertheless, we digress there. Is there a key moment, book that you've read or person you've met, event that you've attended that has completely changed the course of your career or mindset?
In a way, yes. It's a place where I've been, and that was in southern Ethiopia, in a region called the Omo Valley. There's quite a number of indigenous tribes living there. And it's very difficult, the setup, because like there's quite some tourists going there, like just to take pictures of the tribes and they make money with it. Like it wasn't very comfortable, let's say, as a situation to be there. But I was with partners from Ethiopia, from the capital, and they questioned a lot of things in the way how international research is set up. Because it does follow certain colonial patterns, but it's not only linked to colonialism, like it's also linked to power imbalances within the country.
Okay.
From the capital, people who go to the remote areas, and very much changed the way of life there, like already by building a dam there or by forcing former nomadic people like to settle down as an idea of development. And like this experience there was so strong for me and so conflicting that it very much made me change my approach. And it actually links to, like, that's why I didn't directly answer your question about working in tropical countries, because I'm very much questioning that since then. Because there are so many, like the whole way research is set up, and I wrote a paper about that together with my Ethiopian colleagues afterwards, follows a certain narrative. And our narratives are kind of Western narratives of what we think is development, what is environmental friendly, and what is, let's say, the goal of all our research. But other people in other regions have completely different goals, and it's very difficult, if not impossible, for us to understand that and to build that into our research.
Do you think we're ignorant of these other kinds of standards and values?
Well, to a certain degree, of course, it's ignorance, but it's also not necessarily possible to completely understand these values. Maybe we also don't want to, because it conflicts with some of our core beliefs. And once I'm fascinated, and that's why I'm writing about these things, and I'm trying to develop, to document different narratives that underlie science. But at the same time, it makes me feel very humble and makes me think about what am I doing here, let's say.
Yeah.
And that was one of the reasons why I actually also wanted to move more into other areas of research that are closer to my own realities, to my own history, to my background, and contribute to that.
Impactful moment. And thanks for sharing that. And I think too often, we feel like we are trying to help other parts of the world, and especially in the global south. But I think what's important is to have that consciousness and cultural sensitivity towards the value systems in those regions as well before we embark on the research, to really understand what it's like to work in those environments and what is needed and how you respect those value systems.
Yeah, and also accept that they are different, the value systems. And it's difficult to make that fully transparent.
Not easy, but I think it's very crucial. And so what was one of the most challenging situations, apart from that you've ever faced in your career to date? And how did you overcome it?
Well, I had challenging situations before that. And one of them was, for example, when I first worked in that logging camp in the Congo Basin, in Cameroon, actually. When I arrived there and realized that this is actually kind of a fortress built into the jungle.
A fortress?
Not a fortress, but like it's a fenced environment. And there's quite some Europeans working for the logging company. And they fly in their camembert from France. And all kind of things. And it's really like completely secluded from the surroundings. And they do that because they harvest the wood for international markets. Not only for European markets, but for export markets. And they bring in engineers who know how to plan and organize this harvesting, including sustainability managers and all this.
Okay.
But it's a completely implanted system to that environment, because the company provides almost like an oil rig or something, where everything is kind of maintained for the people working there, which is in stark contrast to the living conditions around there.
So highly isolated and in a way not representative of what the country is.
No, it's nothing to do with it. I mean, they still pay taxes and everything, so it's, we discussed about it earlier, like that there is a certain value to the country, and that's why they allow this to happen. But personally, I found it was very challenging to kind of be there, let's say, as a white person in this artificial environment, which was created almost for other white people, and the kind of conflicts that you feel with that. And I mean, in a way, it just represents how the world is, no? Because we live in the fortress of Europe here, and there's big efforts to keep out immigrants with horrible consequences. But when you're there in this part of Africa and you live in this small fortress environment, then you really feel how the world is divided economically and how difficult it is to change that.
And how did you come to terms with that? Because in a way, you still did the research.
I still did the research because I could escape in a way, like because the actual work took place in the forest, and I had the chance to work with a great team of also local people like who were trained to identify tree species. And that was actually very nice and exciting to spend time with them in the forest. But I do remain very critical about this kind of research, and that links again to my realizations, which are difficult to overcome. I still think we need global research. We need to work together on global scale.
But do you feel something has to change.
The way how we do it.
Yeah, I just keep having this image in my head whenever you say fortress. And in a way, it's sad to see, but true. We should be more open to cultures and to embrace it and not be too fenced off, as you said, rather than fencing nature away from humans. It's also not fencing humans away from each other.
Yeah.
What tips and strategies can you offer in terms of time management? I mean, I see you publish a lot of different types of papers and you manage different subject areas. How do you maintain a balance between your professional and your personal time as well?
This is not really a strategy. Like, I'm very kind of spontaneous in the way I work. So I try to maintain or like observe myself while I'm working. And I very regularly ask me this question, actually, what I'm doing right now, is this leading to somewhere? And if I come to the conclusion, actually not, then I just don't do it. Maybe it's called procrastination even. Like, I just do other things.
Okay.
Like, I like to go out in between. I like to, if I work, then I want to work in a focused way. And the rest of the time, I do other things.
Productive procrastination, I guess.
Let's call it like that. But this is really not a strategy because I cannot tell anyone this is the recipe. Like, there's not, you cannot put a plan on your wall and say, oh, this half an hour work, this half an hour going out. It's a very spontaneous process.
There's some people who can do that, and I think others, they're a lot more fluid, if I would say.
I think I'm more the fluid type.
I guess it comes down to understanding, how you work and when you can enter productive states, flow states as they call them, and when you cannot focus. And then I guess working with it, right? Would you put it as that?
Yeah, just accepting that it comes and goes in waves.
Yeah.
You cannot force it, like especially when it's more about, let's say, the writing or the creative part of our work.
I think that in itself is a very good piece of advice because I think too many times people often feel guilty if they procrastinate or if they're not as productive as they could be, when in fact they have bursts of creativity, bursts of productivity. And sometimes they can complete tasks that would take hours in only a matter of a single hour, for example. So, yeah. And so what advice can you offer to young researchers starting out, especially in this field?
Well, I wanted to say go for something that really motivates you, but I think it's important to stay curious. There's this balance. I struggle with it myself, like this balance of being interested in all kinds of things and keeping eyes open. And I think that I definitely would recommend everyone to also read on completely different things that have nothing to do with your topic, like to explore, but then still find the moment to go deep into it. And that's striking this balance. I think it's like the key skill to learn, let's say, to be open for new ones, but then also stick to it and persist into the nitty-gritty of the detail. At least that's what I'm spending most time with my students that I supervise, to get deeper into it and actually stay tuned to it, because it does take a long time from the first idea, which may sound amazing, to actually having it on paper, in a paper or a thesis. I think that's a long way, and the persistence to get there, I think that's a key skill to learn.
In a way, you paint what I have in my image as the T-shaped professional, which we often refer to in interdisciplinary training, where you're deep in your field, but you have the ability to think broadly. And you can only create that, I guess, if you read broadly, if you explore broadly, but then drill down into the topic that you're really interested in. Where can people reach you if they want to get in touch?
Well, if you want to reach me, just go out to the mountains by bike or by foot and look out for me. And I might be just around the next pass.
And hope to randomly find you.
Hope to randomly find me. No, I have a website, actually. It's not always that up to date, but you can find me, fritzk.weebly.com. I mean, I'm also on ResearchGate and on things like that, but these things tend to change a bit. So
yeah, we'll definitely put up some links in the show notes so that listeners can then also reach you through them. Fritz, this has been a wonderful conversation, and I feel we've covered a few topics, but not really covered the full breadth of your experiences, but it definitely paints a picture of who you are and what you're passionate about, and really a key issue that we really need to address in this world. And like I do with every guest, I always give my guests the final word for the episode. So one last message for the listeners to take away from today.
So yeah, we've been talking about all the work that I've done and all the interesting topics that I had the chance and the privilege to explore. But all this I wouldn't be able to without having a great support at home and exploring together with my husband, Tim. And I want to end this episode with saying thank you to him and for being with me and also standing me.
Thank you very much. And thank you to you listeners for tuning into this exciting and wide-ranging conversation with Fritz Kleinschroth. For tips on how not to fly and crash your own drone, more eager beaver pictures, furniture catalogs, or 101 on different ecological and road construction concepts, check out the show notes over at petermbach.com/podcast. If you enjoyed this show and are looking forward to more episodes, please do subscribe. Follow this podcast on Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Music, or wherever you are listening from to be notified of the latest release as soon as it becomes available. Leave a review or pass this on to your friends and family to spread the beautiful messages from our many great guests. If you're curious about me or my work in general, you can also check out my website or social media. Head to petermbach.com, my YouTube channel Peter Marcus Bach, that's Marcus with a C, or follow me on X, formerly Twitter, at Peter M. Bach, or Instagram at petermbach87. Thank you very much for all your support so far. If you have feedback or suggestions, or just know someone who has an inspiring story to offer, please feel free to reach out to me on social media. The podcast's intro and outro song is called Breaking Sweat by Balloon Planet. Stay tuned for our next episode and next guest to hear how they are tackling the grand challenges.